I'm Peter Laws, and welcome to the Flicks the Church Forgot, where I look at the deeper and sometimes spiritual themes of horror movies. Tonight, I'm going to be delving into the so-called undiscovered country to see if I might be able to come back and tell the tale. Yeah, it's resurrection time in the Lazarus Effect. Now, the Lazarus Effect is like a cocktail of a whole host of other horror movies. At first, it feels like Stuart Gordon's Reanimator, with a bunch of young students who dream that one day they might be able to prolong the life of dying patients, long enough at least for them to be revived by a doctor. It's an admirable aim, and to achieve this they've come up with a funky reagent substance which they call the Lazarus serum. To be honest, it looks a little bit more like a runny version of the Stuff, you know, the killer ice cream from the Larry Cohen movie from the 80s. It's named after this Lazarus serum is named after the most famous zombie in the Bible, Lazarus, who Jesus commanded to come forth as he shuffled out of his tomb, much to the shock of everybody. Anyway, like Herbert West in Reanimator, the early stages of the film show the team experimenting on an animal at first. Only in this instance it's a dog rather than a cat like in Reanimator, and they managed to bring this dog back to life, which is great. It's all high fives all round until the dog starts growling madly into the camera and starts breaking out of the cage when it couldn't possibly have done that. And the questions they start asking is not so much what's wrong with the dog, but where has the dog been in those moments when it was technically dead on the slab? Has it changed? Now, once this Reanimator vibe is established, the film starts morphing into another horror film, and that's namely Stephen King's Pet Sematary. Because as you've seen from the trailer, one of the pioneering doctors find themselves dead, and so a boyfriend and colleague on the project is desperate to bring her back, and so, he just goes straight in with using the serum on her. And that's when the film starts to morph into yet another set of horror films, when it becomes more like Stephen King's Carrie a little bit, but also more like every demon possession movie you've seen in the last 40 years. You see, the team have now got to deal with someone who is back from the dead, and yet that person seems altered somehow, and what's more, she actually claims to have been somewhere. She's been somewhere bad. Now, all of these comparisons that I'm making with other films might sound like I'm criticizing the film, but actually I'm not. I think most films emulate and mash up other titles, and indeed there's even more films I could compare the Lazarus Effect to. I'm thinking in particular of the late? I can't remember when it was, in the 90s I think, the medical death adventure movie Flatliners. But anyway, unlike, maybe it was the 80s. Anyway, it's like Flatliners a little bit. The Lazarus Effect though, unlike the films I've been listing that have gotten really good reviews, the Lazarus Effect, they're getting pretty bad reviews. And if you were to look through the internet, you'll find people saying that it's generic, dumb, and unimaginative. The Guardian described it as a dog's dinner. RogerEbert.com said it was a limp excuse for a horror film. Now, I don't particularly think that the Lazarus Effect is a great film or anything, but I do think the critics are being a bit overly harsh on it. I mean, the film's got issues, and I'll come to that, but I tried to watch the film with an open mind, and I think it's more competent than many of the reviewers are making out, at least it was to me. For example, the film's quite interesting thematically. It focuses, at least for a while, on near-death experiences, and it gives a decent amount of screen time to discuss the chemical DMT, which I think is a pretty interesting Fortean subject. By the way, DMT is short for dimethyltryptamine, and that's used to describe a chemical that the human brain produces apparently at the point of death, which can invoke hallucinations. Now, others claim that it's not hallucinations at all, but they're actual experiences of the afterlife, almost like DMT is a lubricant for getting you into the afterlife. In the film, there's a reasonable bit of discussion between whether the DMT experience is authentic or not, and I quite like that being in there. And also, for the first 3/4 of the film particularly, I think the plot holds together pretty well. There's a small turn in the plot exploring the works of corporations and how their funding of medical research goes through and is affected. And I thought it was quite an interesting angle, but sadly the film didn't think it was as interesting as I did, because this angle is just used as a hinge to get to the main horror shenanigans. The film has a different aim in mind, to be fair. This film is not about red tape shenanigans in medical research grants as much as I would have liked to have seen that, or part of it. Rather, the film's obviously a horror movie and it's exploring life after death. And so it unfolds the backstory of Zoe while exploring what she might have been through when she died. And so the world it throws the viewer into is basically, starts to feel in some ways a little bit more generic. And I think that is because some of the makeup design in some ways, I mean, it's not terrible or anything, but I just think the whole scary woman flicking open black eyes is not exactly a cutting edge image in horror. And I think the film could have been strengthened if it just brought a more daring and an imaginative makeup design that might have given the post-mortem look a more chilling and unique feel. James Wan's Insidious, I mentioned that a couple of episodes ago, that got some criticism for its weird red and black faced demon. It looked a bit like Darth Maul's creepy brother, but I for one really appreciated seeing a monster or a demon that I'd never seen before. But because in the Lazarus Effect they go for a more straightforward horror face, you know what I'm talking about, the horror face that screams out of hundreds of YouTube fake demon videos, it's that sort of vibe. I think the film therefore starts feeling a little bit generic in some ways in points. But actually the plot and ideas for the films are a little bit more ambitious than that gives it credit. The film does attempt to do a few things differently. In some of the deaths, for example, unusual. They don't always work, but at least they're unusual. But there's still plenty of people thrown across the room by invisible forces, which makes you feel like you've seen it all before. So when you couple these familiar horror images with the fact that the film is clearly inspired by a bunch of other flicks, like I've already mentioned, I think many critics just write the film off as a complete waste of time. However, I do think it's hasty to say that there's nothing of value to the Lazarus Effect, and I think it's been interesting to read some of the more general tweets from viewers and people who've watched the film who've said that the film's actually quite scary and effective. I was heartened and reassured as well when, after writing up my fairly positive-ish review of The Lazarus Effect, I noticed that revered horror critic Kim Newman described it as a decent, well-made genre film. Was I scared? Not really. Particularly when so many of the jump scares are telegraphed way too early. Like a character leans by a dog's head and he assumes the dog's deceased, but you're just waiting and drumming your fingers. You're like, oh yeah, the dog's going to wake up now. Whoa, oh yeah, the dog woke up. What a shock. This sort of like telegraphing of jump shocks happens several times in the film. Also, the character of Frank, played by Mark Duplass, is a bit odd. Like the first time we see him, he's being interviewed on a camera and he's cracking up. He's unable to do his piece to camera because he's like, oh, he's laughing his head off, and it feels a bit fake and strange. And there's a moment when one of the characters gets something stuck in their throat, and it's okay idea, it's an alright scene. But Frank is like staring down the guy's throat, yelling, what the hell is it? What the hell is it in there? And I'm sitting there thinking, are you an idiot? It's obvious what's in there. Not only was this death telegraphed 30 minutes before, but more to the point, the camera is pointing in this guy's mouth, and you can clearly see what it is that's lodged down his throat. You can actually see it. But Frank's like, what the hell is it? What the hell is it? And you're like, he's so unobservant. And I appreciate I might be being picky here, but Frank is presented as a bit of a genius, which makes it so strange why he occasionally behaves like the biggest idiot on the planet. Well, he's not that bad, but it's just stuff I noticed. Anyway, these are not enough to warrant hatred of it. Technically speaking, I think the film is put together very well. What I especially liked was the opening title shots with the serum being manipulated with electricity or something, and the gloop is sort of rising in odd peaks and spikes, and the close-up photography just looks very cool. And while some reviewers insist that the movie's all about jump scares, to be fair to it, I think it does have a few lines and ideas in it that are clearly trying to press the more creepy button rather than just the big jump shock button. For example, when Zoe grabs Frank's arm and asks a reasonable but very messed up question, did I just die? I mean, that line, that idea is pretty dark and interesting. And there's also a few discussions about where she's been when she was dead, some of which were dealing, I think, in some pretty creepy concepts. It's hard not to notice that the nature of life after death in this film, let's put it this way, is far more in keeping with a religious worldview than an atheistic worldview, which ironically is one of the things horror often does. In a world obsessed with rationalism, horror is one of the few places where most people want the world of the film to be irrational and unpredictable, or in other words, supernatural, if you will. Or at least the audiences, even if they don't want the supernatural in their own lives, we want to keep that option open in horror. Now, there was a point in the second half of the film where I started feeling like the film had strayed into being influenced by yet another type of movie, and that was, bear with me, the superhero origin movie. Now, basically we have a suddenly souped up human who's crossed the ether, and she's now firing out newfound powers, and the film does set itself up as a film that it potentially could have a sequel, although I doubt they'll make one, but it sets itself up that way potentially. And watching it, I was thinking, I guess she could make a good comic book character, someone who's been transformed not by a radioactive bite, but by the experience of death itself, which is kind of cool, quite a cool idea, although I'm not really into superheroes. I thought that could be a superhero, I suppose, but anyway, I was overthinking it. I think the Lazarus Effect could have been better, especially if it hadn't just turned into a sort of pseudo science fiction possession movie and took some more daring choices in its design. But I would say the damning reviews across the internet are a bit unfair. I can think of worse horror movies doing the rounds, a lot worse, and at least this one tries to do something different. The only thing is, I think it ironically uses such a complicated cocktail of other films to make it stand out, which I've said is no bad thing, but because it also makes a few mistakes along the way, I think the Lazarus Effect therefore can actually appear more generic than it really is. I think if you give it a chance and be forgiving with it, you might find that it's actually a reasonably distracting mashup of horror flicks that play with some fairly interesting Fortean ideas.
3, 2, 1.
Now, just as an aside, I watched The Lazarus Effect straight after I put my 6-year-old daughter to bed. And I've been reading Roald Dahl's book, George's Marvelous Medicine, to her. Now, the story of that is a young boy who gives his grandma a cocktail of drugs, liquids, and substances from his house, and the result is that she mutates and stretches into this hideous, skinny, tall monster as big as the house. And as I watched The Lazarus Effect, it was interesting to see in this little cocktail of a movie, a woman is given an odd concoction, and she is therefore completely transformed. The family in the end of the book manages to reverse the effect of George's Marvelous Medicine, and the granny starts to shrink back to her normal size. Only she doesn't stop. She gets smaller and smaller until she's the size of a milk bottle, and then a pencil, and then a needle, and then a pumpkin seed, and then in her daughter's hand she just utterly vanishes, at least vanishes from their sight, although we assume she's still microscopic and she's existing down there. And how does Dahl have the family react? Well, after that, they all look horrified. The mum and dad just say, oh well, maybe it's for the best, and they just get on with their lives. Even while George is left stunned and sort of in awe that he's just experienced something magical, he also is aware that someone has died, potentially, to do it, and so there's a twisted darkness to this magic as well. In some ways, I'd say the Lazarus Effect is moving in similar grooves. It wants to unpack the power of death and the marvel and the wonder of potentially beating it. But it's saying, maybe as well as magic, there is darkness, threat, and danger there too. Well, that's it for the Flicks the Church Forgot. Join me in the next episode where I'm going to be expanding a little bit on one of the key topics of the Lazarus Effect. Namely, I'll be examining the phenomenon of near-death experiences, and I'm going to be asking whether there might be any validity to them or not. But until then, don't forget, the next time you and your doctor friends are thinking about creating some sort of resurrection serum, just remember what old Judd Crandall said. Sometimes dead is better, and sometimes it's best not to forget the flicks the church forgot.